Good evening, everyone. I'm Ulrike Rösler, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, those here in the auditorium and also those who are joining us online today to hear this year's Aris lecture. Aris lectures have been held at Wolfson every year since 2015 to celebrate the contributions of Michael and Anthony Aris to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies. Michael Aris was one of the pioneers of Tibetan studies when it emerged as an academic discipline during the 1970s and 80s. He had been to Bhutan as a private tutor to the children of the Bhutanese royal family. And after his return, he became the first to teach Tibetan language and history at Oxford, even before a university program in this subject existed. His twin brother Anthony is well known through his publishing house Sera India, which has produced the most exquisite volumes on Tibet and the Himalayas. Both of them have therefore made unique and long-lasting contributions to the field. Sadly, neither of them is with us anymore, but we are profoundly grateful for the generosity of those who have helped to endow an annual Aris lecture here at Wolfson College so that we have an occasion to celebrate and remember the work of both Aris brothers. Previous Aris lectures were delivered by such distinguished speakers as Janet Yazzo, Charles Ramble, and Per Kverne. This year, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Sera Jacoby from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where she teaches Tibetan Buddhism in the Department of Religious Studies. Professor Jacoby's research interests include topics such as Buddhist revelation, the treasure tradition, religious biography and autobiography, the history of emotions, and gender in Tibetan literature. She has co-produced two important volumes, one on Buddhism introducing the Buddhist experience, and the other on Buddhism beyond the monastery, tantric practices and their performers in Tibet and the Himalayas. Sera Jacoby is particularly interested in the lives and roles of women in Tibetan Buddhism. In October this year, she hosted a major translation workshop on the theme of celebrating Buddhist women's voices in the Tibetan tradition, which focused on the issue of translating Tibetan texts by and about women. Professor Jacoby herself has engaged in studying and translating the life story of one particular female Buddhist master, Sera Khandro. She has published her research in the book Love and Liberation, Autobiographical Writings of the Tibetan Buddhist visionary Sera Khandro, published in 2014. She is also currently working on a full English translation of Sera Khandro's autobiography. This will allow English language readers to enjoy Sera Khandro's complete life story as told by herself, and we can look forward to the publication of this fascinating work. Sera Khandro will also be the focus of today's Aris lecture, which has the title Women and Wit in Tibetan Buddhist Literature. We look very much forward to your lecture, Sera, and please join me in making Sera Jacoby very welcome.
It's truly an honor to be here today in this time of pandemic and post-pandemic. It feels very special to be in a place outside of the realm of my everyday familiar. Today, walking around Oxford and seeing the really, really old buildings, I was incredibly impressed. I went to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, which is basically a pretend Oxford, you know, like the American New version. So for me to be in the real is incredibly special. I'd like to express my thanks to Dr. Ulrike Rösler for inviting me to speak today, and also to Dr. Lama Jap for the fantastic conversations that we've been having about Tibetan translation and Sera Khandro for some time now. It's truly a huge honor to participate in this esteemed lecture series dedicated to Michael and Anthony Aris. I never had the chance to meet Michael Aris, but I did meet Anthony, which was really a memorable experience. I met Anthony Aris here at Oxford University almost 20 years ago. So actually, I've only ever been to Oxford one time in my life, and this was for less than a week. It was at the International Association of Tibetan Studies meeting in 2003. And not only did I have the pleasure of meeting Anthony Aris, but also that was the very first moment I ever opened my mouth in public in the sense of giving my very first lecture of my career. And of course, I was terribly nervous and very happy when it was over. But when it was over, a person walked up to me after my lecture and introduced himself. He was a scholar from Italy. And to fast forward here, I ended up marrying him. And we've been married for 14 years now. He has a name. His name is Antonio Terone. And so if I hadn't come to Oxford once 20 years ago, none of these things would have happened. So I'm very grateful for all of that and to be here again today. Okay, so on to women and wit in Tibetan Buddhist literature. First, I'll talk a little bit about women in Tibetan literature, and then we'll move on to wit. It used to be that a talk about women in Tibetan literature would begin with a lament about the paucity of available sources. Certainly, there's still due cause for such lament, since we hear considerably less about women than we do about men as authors and historical actors in the Tibetan cultural sphere. Looking just at the expansive genre of Tibetan biography, Namtar, only a very small fraction of the thousands of extant works are written by or about female protagonists. Women in Tibet had a much lower literacy rate than men did, varying in relation to their social and monastic status. Educational opportunities for nuns in Tibet did not compare to those for monks, where nuns' education existed at all. And what Tibetan women did manage to write was much less likely to receive enough patronage to make it into print. Nevertheless, in the 21st century, Tibetan women's writings are taking center stage, especially in the Tibetan area of Amdo. In 2005, the esteemed writer and professor Hwalmo edited an anthology of Tibetan women's writing called The Milking Toggle, Sholung. She's since published further collections featuring many Tibetan women's poetry and prose, as well as her own writing. Getting particular acclaim these days is the poetry of Chime from Rebkong. Chime is just now coming to be known in the Anglophone world with the first ever translation of one of her poems into English called The Ring, Alung, by your very own Dr. Lama Jap, published in the new journal Yeshe. There are also other short stories written by Tsejun Ki from Badzong County in Amdo. I've been thinking a lot about her lately because my PhD student Somtobum is writing about them, among other works, for her dissertation project. Over the hill in India, there's also a vibrant scene of women writers these days with the works of Min Nangze, originally from Golok, and Nima Tso, who's published Tibetan poetry, prose, and prolific numbers of children's books. Her beautiful poem, Samta, Borderland, has recently been translated into English by Nicole Willock and will be published soon. In North America, we are fortunate to have the writers Khaosang Hamo and Tenzin Diki, both also working at the Buddhist Digital Resource Center in Boston. As well as, I'm giving you a minute here to look at the pictures, hence the pause. As well as Tsering Wamo Dumpa and Tsering Yangzon Lama, who both write in English. This book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, just came out a couple of months ago. It's beautiful, and you should rush out and buy it if you haven't already, in my humble opinion. True for all the works I just showed. Several of these writers were lauded last April at a fantastic conference organized by Tashi Diki, Erin Burke, and Jue Liang at the University of Virginia called Tibetan Women Writing Symposium, a celebration of Tibetan women's literature. You may also have heard about this because your very own Dr. Lama Jop presented a keynote speech there, which we at Northwestern University were honored to hear soon after. All of this energy and excitement about contemporary Tibetan women writers can give the impression that they've emerged out of the blue, rising up from the dark depths of women's silence in the Tibetan historical record. Or perhaps they thrive more fully in the space of the contemporary secular world instead of the strictures of Buddhist tradition. But neither of these points is entirely true. Alongside the groundswell of publishing by and about secular Tibetan women writers, we find parallel publishing projects related to women in Tibetan religious literature, both contemporary and historical. Notable work in this area has come out of Larongar in the Serta region of eastern Tibet. In 2011, a group of nuns from Larongar formed the Larong Arya Tare Petok Tsomdrikang and searched throughout Tibet for works by and about Buddhist women. They did this in their spare time between Buddhist philosophy classes and other ritual duties. When they found works written by women, they were often single manuscript copies, some in states of disrepair. They then had to purchase computers, learn how to type, and manually create digital versions of all the material they collected. And you can see them doing that here in their office at Larongar. In 2017, their efforts resulted in the publication of the largest ever anthology of Buddhist women's writings in the Tibetan language, totaling 53 volumes, called the Khandro Dewé Dorjé, Dakini's Great Dharma Treasury. Now, no one can say that women have never played a major part in Tibetan Buddhist history. This massive collection is divided into 4 parts, and don't worry, I know that's small. I'm not expecting that we're going to read through all of that, but you can find this in an article that Padmatso and I co-authored called Lessons from Buddhist Foremothers, published in this book, Voices from Larongar. The first 18 volumes of this massive collection are about biographies of female Buddhist figures from South Asia, a few from China and many from Tibet. It begins with material from the Vinaya and Sutra Pitaka, and then moves on to a variety of dakinis and protectresses before centering on historical Tibetan women. About there. Featuring very well-known figures and texts, as well as rare accounts of important but less well-known Tibetan women. Hope you memorized all of that by now. The second section, from volume 19 to 49, contains collected works, sungbum, of Tibetan female masters and their religious teachings. Third, volume 50, is a collection of praise texts for female deities and human masters. And fourth, volumes 51 and 52 contain advice for women by an array of Buddhist masters. The volumes culminate with a 253-page table of contents at the end. My colleague Padmatso and I interviewed members of the Larong Arya Tare Petok to find out why they dedicated themselves so zealously to this project. You can hear their words and our analysis in this article, Gender Equality in and on Tibetan Nuns' Terms. but probably the most succinct statement about these nuns' goals can be found in the preface to the Dakini's Great Dharma Treasury. I won't read all of this in the interest of time, but I'm going to start, if you can see right there. Secondly, our objective is for the global readership in general and for our Tibetan girls in particular not to think we are women and consider ourselves inferior on account of differences between men and women that are based on a few outdated customs of male superiority and female inferiority, which have been tossed aside as merely bygone history, or based on a few differences in physical strength. It goes on, and then the conclusion down here is, we have published, distributed, and promoted this priceless collection as medicine to nourish the well-being and happiness of the world in general, and in particular as a gift for female Dharma practitioners of the snowland of Tibet who are its great stewards. You can read more about what Larongar nuns had to say about all of this to us, but here I want to emphasize the way they decried the view of male superiority and female inferiority, pochok momen getawa, as well as the importance they placed on having diverse female role models available for future generations of Tibetan women and girls, who are the great stewards of the snowland. I also want to point out that it isn't only secular Tibetan women who are publishing short stories and poetry in various Tibetan language venues today. Also, in 2011, a different group of Larongar nuns established an annual journal called Gankar Lhamo, featuring mostly poetry and short essays written by Tibetan nuns, as well as a few laywomen. The writings in Gankar Lhamo cover diverse topics, but many emphasize the importance of education for girls, devotional praise for their gurus, as well as reflection on women's status in Tibetan society. And my colleague Padma Tso, I think, is working on a fuller presentation of this material in her own research. The importance of these publication projects is very fresh in my mind because I've just hosted a conference, which Ulrika mentioned, at Northwestern that was inspired especially by the Larongar nuns Dakini's Great Dharma Treasury. The event was a translation workshop called Celebrating Buddhist Women's Voices in the Tibetan Tradition, which I co-organized with Padma Tso, Holly Gailey, and Dominique Townsend, thanks to funding from the Tsadra Foundation and Luce ACLS. Did I hear you say you wanted to hear more photos? I think I heard that, right? I put this up here because I'm happy to tell you that the full audio from this workshop is now downloadable from Tsadra's website. So you don't have to just take my word for this. You can go take part in listening to all of these conversations that we just had. Again, I don't really think you're going to read all that. This slide is up here so you can see the lovely images of all these wonderful people who came. The premise of this is it was a translation workshop. So in the afternoons, we had people come and present draft translations, and we paired them with a senior translator to give feedback and advice on a line-by-line kind of level. But we also had breakout sessions covering many topics, such as translating the women's voices in Tibetan texts, issues that come up with that, feminist translation practices. We had one kind of pushing the envelope called Heteronormativity and Yabyum Symbolism, translation fidelity or intervention, meaning when you come up with something fully misogynist in a text, what do you do with that? Translating contemporary women's writings, and Buddhist tropes of masculinity were all different themes that we covered. I think my favorite part of this event was the celebration of Tibetan women writers that we had. And so we had Tsering Yangdzom Lama, Kunzang Choden came all the way from Bhutan, Tenzin Deki from Boston, Nimatso from India, Dharamsala, Kazang Lhamo from Boston, Rekjong, a PhD student at my university who was our fearless translator, and Dechen Pemba, perhaps you all know her. She lives down the road from here in London. And so the other great thing is the whole Tibetan community in the greater Chicago area came out to celebrate. So what was really nice was just, and François Robin, point out right there, who I lump as part of the European Tibetological world. So you probably see more of her than we do in the US. It was fantastic. And then here at the final lunch, a few comments about this image. It makes me happy to see this because here on the shores of Lake Michigan, it really looks like the future of Tibetan Buddhist studies, or more generally of Tibetan studies, is largely Tibetan. And that, I think, is a great thing. The other thing here, we have Chola Tenzin Dadun, who came all the way from Malaysia, originally from Bhutan, and Venerable Karma Lekshe Tomo, Ayo Yetunde was with them, who wrote a really fascinating book edited called Black and Buddhist, about Buddhism in America. And so this combination of thinking about Tibetan literature, where we're looking at both religious literature, historical literature, and contemporary literature, and we're having a conversation between these different areas. I think that was the most exciting element. Padma and myself, and we also managed to get the head editor of the Khandro Dewé Chemo, the Dakinis Great Dharma Treasury, to speak to us via video. So that was that. Thinking about the Dakinis Great Dharma Treasury is a good segue for the direction that I want to turn now, to the writings of Sera Khandro Dewé Dorjé. Sera Khandro appears to be the most prolific female writer in Tibetan history. A full 8 volumes of the Dakinis Great Dharma Treasury are works by Sera Khandro, which is about 15% of the collection and more than any other single author. The magnitude of Sera Khandro's prolixity is also apparent in another series called Kangchen Keme Petok, Women of the Snowland series, published in 2015 in Chengdu by Sichuan Mirik Pedrong Kang. Here, Sera Khandro's writings comprise a full half of the series, right there. It's interesting to consider how new this increasingly widespread appreciation of Sera Khandro as a Tibetan Buddhist virtuoso and literary giant is. Or to put that another way, how much time has passed since the end of her life in 1940 and the first publication of her works in Tibetan in 2009. Sera Khandro's collected works, and within that, her autobiography, were published by the Golok Kul Natsom Chawe Shunglekang, the Golok Regional Government Office of Historical Manuscripts, under the main editorship of the esteemed Tibetan writer Zhu Kaozang. In the preface, he writes, quote, "Although there were many religious teachings, subsequently they fell prey to a time of turmoil, zuzing, leaving only a few remaining, and copies of these manuscripts are extremely rare. In other words, the reception of Sera Khandro's works is punctuated by the rupture caused by Tibet's incorporation into the People's Republic of China and the ensuing decades of chaos and devastation capped by the Cultural Revolution. The impact of this trauma on Tibetan lives and religious lineages cannot be overstated. Like that of so many other families, Sera Khandro's bloodline was cut during the Cultural Revolution when her grandson died. It's bizarre to imagine how different the story of Sera Khandro's reception might have been without this loss. It's not that Tibetans didn't know about Sera Khandro until someone came along and discovered her, but rather that her memory and her manuscripts have circulated locally in communities descended from her direct disciples. This is Chatra Sangye Dorje holding one of the handwritten manuscripts of Sera Khandro. This is how I heard about her almost 30 years ago when I had the chance to spend some time with her disciple, Kyabje Chatra Sangye Dorje Rinpoche, who carefully brought his full set of her manuscripts with him to South Asia when he left Tibet in the 1950s. Dujum Jigjal Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche also brought her manuscripts with him. And by the way, this is a picture of my friend Christina Monson and myself receiving reading transmission of Sera Khandro's teachings from Chatur Rinpoche. Dudjom Jigdral Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche also brought her manuscripts with him, and in India reproduced a 4-volume set of her Tertre, her revelations. In Tibet, I also found collections of Sera Khandro's manuscripts in several different sites in Kham and Amdo. And I heard that there's a set also at Rinpoche, where Sera Khandro passed away in 1940. Speaking of the Dudjom lineage, this is the Dudjom heartland in Dartang Golok. You can see here Lama Gompa Kyap, a lama who is a Sera Khandro lineage holder residing there. And then another person I want to point out is Trunle Tenzin. This is a really old photo. He's probably, I'm sure he's an adult now, a young adult. Trunle Tenzin right here, who is a blood descendant of Traktung Dudjom Lingpa, and was recognized in childhood as the speech incarnation of Sera Khandro. There are several, not just him, but this is the local Dudjom family incarnation. This is another image for you from another manuscript collection mission. One thing I think is funny about this picture, this is at Dralak Gompa in Ganze, and they kindly let me sit in their library and look through their manuscripts. I look really cold, don't I? It was August, and this image of Dralak Kempo was taken at the same time, and so I think temperature is, you know, a very personal thing. Like, I recall feeling like I was freezing. Luckily, I was there in August and not January, right? There's a huge amount to say about the writings of Sera Khandro, much more than I could possibly even gesture toward in the time available today, so you should go read these books if you want to hear more. If you're philosophically inclined, then choose Refining Our Perception of Reality, translated by Ngawang Zangpo. This is Sera Khandro's Nangjang, a philosophical work, her commentary on Dudjom Lingpa's Magom Sangye, Buddhahood without meditation. And then for a more sort of social, historical perspective on Sera Khandro, there's Love and Liberation. Sera Khandro's collected works include volumes of her revealed scriptures, her terma, hymns, gur, visionary experiences, nyamnang, advice, shaldam, philosophical commentaries such as this Nangjang, prophecy, lungten, and biography, namtar. Regarding the latter, first she wrote the biography of her guru, Drimeoser, one of the sons of Traktung Dudjom Lingpa, and then she began composing her own autobiography, which is almost twice the size of his biography, completing hers in 1934. Sera Khandro's autobiography charts her pathway to complete liberation, Nampar Tarpa, beginning with preliminary practices and culminating in the pinnacle contemplative system of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, Dzogpa Chenpo, the great perfection. Unfolding across the pages of her autobiography is Sera Khandro's discovery of her true identity as an incarnation of Yechit Tsogyal, destined to reveal scriptures and sacred artifacts known as treasures. Sera Khandro's renown stems from her illustrious career as a treasure revealer, but it also stems from her elegant, inspiring, poetic, and profound writing style. The autobiography sings with poetry and song written in diverse meters, evocative of classical Buddhist hymns, gur, as well as everyday song forms such as street songs, she, and love songs, lai. Alliteration, assonance, word repetition, and acrostic punctuate Sera Khandro's verses, producing an autobiography as aesthetically as it is spiritually rich. Interspersed with the melodies of her metered verses is uncommonly candid prose, much of it written as dialogue between interlocutors speaking in a colloquial nomadic dialect characteristic of Golok, where she spent her entire adult life. Through these dialogues, Sera Khandro effects a literary feat of bringing a whole social atmosphere that has rarely been put on paper to life, one that voices gritty truths about the desperation, domestic labor, abuse, denigration, exclusion, loss, and grief that marked her life and that of so many other women in her world. Splicing through these traumas are Sera Khandro's visions of dakinis, goddess-like figures who appeared to her with counsel and encouragement, succoring her spiritual aspirations. Sera Khandro's dialogues with dakinis, as well as with a host of other non-human apparitions and vital forces inhabiting the sacred landscape, challenged the metaphysics of modernity, calling upon us as her readers to reimagine the porosity of personal agency and beckoning us to join her in exploring the exuberant radiance of the celestial Buddha fields she envisioned. But today, I would like to temporarily shield our eyes from this radiance and turn instead toward the ground of early 20th century Tibet by zeroing in on one element of Sera Khandro's writing style that I find key to its candor, her wit. So now we're moving into the second part of the talk title on wit. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, and what better source could I really quote? It's probably like French fries. Americans probably think they're made in France. Probably the Oxford English Dictionary has nothing to do with Oxford, but at least it's Oxford University Press, so I'm going with it. According to the OED, wit is, quote, a quality of speech or writing which consists in the apt association of thought and expression, calculated to surprise and delight by its unexpectedness. Later, always with reference to the utterance of brilliant or sparkling things in an amusing way, end quote. What I want to think about with you today is wit that amuses not in the sense of joviality, but something sharper. The power of wit to sting is dressed in the art of wordplay, musicality, double entendre, and metaphor. As with other forms of metaphoric language, wit is grounded in the materiality and experiences of everyday life, from which it draws its imagery and vocabulary. Wit can pack a punch of social critique. One isn't always sure whether to laugh or cry. These are precisely the features that make wit so hard to translate. What is funny or ironic in one time and place often leaves those of us more distant from it scratching our heads, trying to catch up to the pace of the banter and work out the implied associations and cultural knowledge. The social critique conveyed through wit is also challenging to translate, for it refers to what people are doing and shouldn't be in the world outside of the text. But this is also one of its greatest values, for it reveals much more than the actual words written on the page. In the remaining time, we will read some passages from Sera Khandro's autobiography together. The autobiography is called Umo Dewé Dorjé Nambartaba Ngejungdrembe Shingda Kaldan Depe Chodong, the biography of the central Tibetan woman Dewé Dorjé, a chariot leading to renunciation and a reliquary of faith for fortunate ones. And it is 400 to 500 pages long, depending on the handwriting or typeset. I've been working on a complete translation of this work for some time, and I'm really trying to finish it. That's why I mentioned how many pages it is, just to offer a little explanation. So I'll give you an advance read of some choice passages. All right, episode 1 on dogs and men. Sera Khandro was born in 1892 in Lhasa. During this time, Qing rule in Tibet was waning, and the Ambans living in Lhasa, representing the Qing court, had little power over Tibetan affairs. The 13th Dalai Lama assumed political control in 1895. Sera Khandro was born in a 4-story stone estate named Gyarakashar that looked something like these, located near the Jokang around the Barkor. Her father, Jampa Gombo, was of Mongolian ancestry and held a position of political leadership, and her mother, Tsering Chunzum, was Tibetan from the Nup clan. In 1904, when Sera Khandro was only 12, that would be 13 in Tibetan years, her beloved mother passed away, and her father began arranging her marriage to a man from another politically powerful family. Sera Khandro was determined to avoid that future and pursue her religious calling. So she ran away and joined a group of Lhasa pilgrims headed by Dudjom Lingpa's son, Tuku Jimeoser. This is the route they would follow outside of Lhasa and back to their homeland, starting in Lhasa, walking all the way over here to this shaded area, which is Golok. And this would take 8 months on foot. In the passage I'm about to read, the year is 1907 and Sera Khandro is 15. She has just escaped from her family home and is trying to catch up to the group of pilgrims. Soon, hunger motivates her to try to beg for food for the very first time in her life. In her words, "I came down to a large plain where nomads' tents were pitched. I didn't know what they were. I wondered if they were wild yaks people said were on the Changtang, and I didn't dare approach. In the evening, the nomads herded their horses, yak, and sheep from all directions and kept them next to the tent. Only then I understood that they were nomads, and I went over to beg for food. I didn't have a begging bag, so I put the food in my boot. Everybody roared with laughter, saying, 'She's a crazy girl.' Gemushik nyuma mare, drangsarshik yimbadra serne. Morange ngala gugmachik shinduongne. Atse pumo zema kyozukche lekbe, ki kane tarung, keba namge ogne tar kawada zer." "She's not a crazy girl," an old woman said. "She seems to be a new beggar. Coming forward to give me a bag, she exclaimed, 'Wow, beautiful girl, with that fine figure, you may be able to escape from the mouths of dogs, but it will be difficult to escape from the loins of men.' I took the food with me." Notable in this passage is what Sera Khandro doesn't write. Nowhere does she describe the old woman turning to the family dog and restraining it from attack. She doesn't have to, because anyone who's ever been a stranger walking up to a Tibetan nomad's tent can picture what happens next. In our mind's eye, we can imagine the peril and proximity of dog bites in this risky business of begging. This minimalist depiction of a whole situation is one feature that makes this great Tibetan literature. And then there is what she does write, especially how she compares dogs and men. The parallelism in the phrasing, ki ka netar and keba namge og netar, makes it clear that we are meant to consider what qualities dogs and men share. But even this is a touch understated, for she specifies that dogs' mouths are the menace. But as for men, it is, quote, the underneath of men. What is that exactly? Is it being underneath men in this general sense of being subordinate to men's authority? Or is it the physical body part underneath men that is the menace? What sticks with me in reading Sera Khandro here is that this is the very, very beginning of her life on her own as a woman who travels in strange lands, embodying the religious ideal of renouncing hearth and home. This old woman's quip reads like a threat and a warning, foreshadowing the troubles to come. The woman seems to say, and this is my American translation, or maybe I should say transposition, "Oh my goodness, you're going to be screwed looking like that out here in this dangerous world." This prophecy is both specific to this Tibetan place and time and universal. It is a kind of women's wisdom passed down from elder to junior with care and concern, knowing what violence awaits those who attract men's lust. Episode 2, Sera Khandro's silencing power. Sera Khandro had a tendency to leave her interlocutors speechless, unable to find an apt reply. This feature comes up over and over again, but I'll give you just one example. So now we're moving along with Sera Khandro to Golok, which in the early 20th century was by and large an independent territory that neither paid tribute to the Dalai Lama's government to the west, nor to the Qing or later Republican China to the east. And I want to point out one spot, Dartsang, that's where she's going to end up, right on the Serta side of the current Sichuan-Qinghai border. This is an image from the Austrian botanist Joseph Rock, who traveled through Golok at the same time that Sera Khandro lived there, just to give you a feel. Golok is perhaps even more famous for its fierce warriors and ruthless banditry than for being the homeland of a host of great Nyingma masters, including the Jujum lineage, but also Dokensei Yeshe Dorje, and a stream of many others. Through the lens of Sera Khandro's writing, we hear a great deal about both the vices and the virtues of life on the Golok grasslands. This is what these places looked like when I visited, but surely they were totally different when Sera Khandro arrived. When she arrived at Dartsang, along with Drimyo Ser's group of pilgrims, everyone's kin was delighted and welcomed them home, leaving Sera Khandro completely alone, embodying the true meaning of going from householder life into homelessness. At first, she tried to rent a room in Drimyo Ser's Labrang, but that didn't pan out because Drimyo Ser's Yum, Akyongza, had no interest in housing the young and beautiful Central Tibetan girl, or Umo, as they called her. She then worked as a maidservant for a local Golok family, which was initially difficult because she couldn't understand them, which, by the way, makes a ton of sense to me because I went to Golok after studying Tibetan in Lhasa, thinking that, oh, I can understand this language. And then, oh my gosh, it took a while. But I didn't have to walk for 8 months, so there's no comparison I'm really trying to draw. Initially, Sera Khandro didn't know how to do the work, tending livestock and doing domestic labor in a nomad's tent. By the time she was 17, she'd gotten the hang of all of that and was eager to extricate herself from such samsaric occupations, to devote herself fully to Dharma practice. The Golok family tried to convince Sera Khandro to stay and marry one of their sons, but she had no interest. Sensing her resolve, they agreed to send her off to Karnang Gongma and Golok to stay with their relative, a nun named Tsuldrun, and receive Dharma instruction with her from Zamura Tuku. Tsuldrun found Sera Khandro's identity as neither nun nor laywoman, Jomin Nakmin, unacceptable, and urged Muratuku to ordain Sera Khandro as a nun. This prompted a long dialogue between Sera Khandro and Muratuku about what living virtuously really means. After this, Sera Khandro narrates, "Dene dakchirung ne Tsuldrun da mika tang dunme gi laser namna daki lundra micheba kelan yu. De min ngarange jomo mache metse. Monare atse kyurgi ngola Drongpa Kunyobadra, Lachen Kondabula, Dendra Zikzog Chila Shupu Sershing, Dramsha Tendu. Daki Rang Tupkechawa Konla Shubi, Mi Pupamendu, Dewe Laptom Kokla Nyamna, De Mupu Metse, Morangi Chiang Miser. Then I came back and told Tsuldrun, I promise not to have a physical relationship with lay people or with religious people who lack a reason. Aside from that, I am not going to be a nun. She replied, wow, it's as if you wear wild yak hide on your face, which I think we would say, you have such thick skin. You're not feeling shame. Who would dare say such dirty words to a great lama like him? And she pulled her cheeks like surprise, shock. I retorted, since I told him what I'm able to do, there is no not daring. What I wouldn't dare do is let my vows and precepts secretly deteriorate. She didn't say anything. With an economy of words, Sera Khandro leaves much more insinuated but unsaid about her nun interlocutor, offering critique at the same time as defending her choice to have relationships when they were meaningful, dun yeba. For one of the requisites for successful treasure revelation is having a consort. There's much more to say about that, but you'll have to read the book version to find out. Okay, Episode 3, 2 songs. Despite her best intentions to pursue meaningful relationships, Sera Khandro ended up settling down with Gara Gyaltse, son of Gara Terchen Pema Dundo Wangjuk Lingpa of Benak Monastery, situated on the Mara River in what is today Pema County, Golok. Her relationship with Gyaltse quickly soured, partly because he didn't support her increasing renown as a treasure revealer. In the passage that follows, Sera Khandro is 21 years old and the year is 1913. This is what happened next. Dene daki shinkurne rangkem laongwe ngarang gorche soe Gyaltse la solcha drang chi soe kengi chakpep nangne kim kichi la wujung. Then I gathered firewood and returned home quite late. Because I was delayed in serving Gyaltse his tea, he smacked me and threw me out of the house. I'm not going to read this whole thing in Tibetan in the interest of time, but I just want to point out that the metered verse is 6 syllables and much smoother and more beautiful in Tibetan, right? So, Benak dukta nena togan korlo korki, and it continues in a smooth way. It's very hard to translate that into English. You lose the meter if you keep the meaning. I was devastated and sang a song of despair like this. In the sorrow grove of Benak, bad monk, an evil entourage encircles me. As I sing this despairing song of sadness, a crow caws, aye. The face of my evil life partner is like the sun's crooked shadow on the rocky slope. Our home is an empty hollow in a dark cliff, the foundation of shade, coldness, and disease. I'm a beggar girl from a distant land with only the blue sky as my friend in sorrow. Forget about practicing authentic Dharma. It's difficult to stop our daily quarreling. Now I will abandon this evil conduct of being neither servant nor bride and go wander about the country. Gyaltse said, "What are you talking about?" And he told me to come boil his tea. When I returned to the house, his anger had subsided. "What was that song you sang?" he asked. I told him that I sang a song like this. In the pleasure grove of Benyak, good monk, the man born in the horse year has a disposition like the weather in the 3 summer months, ever shifting from friendly to ferocious. The turquoise dragon from the south has exuberant strength, but sometimes she will be unable to do anything. When the force of this karmic energy is finished, karma will determine what will happen. I sang this song. Then the local people hated me and said that I was a demoness. I laid low and kept the treasure texts that were coming to me extremely secret. Reading this, I'm struck by how much this writing has in common with issues contemporary Tibetan women writers are addressing, such as domestic abuse. I'm also struck by the 2 versions of the same song, one that explicitly states Sera Khandro's despair, and the other that encodes her meaning in front of Gyaltse. The man born in the horse year is Gyaltse, and the turquoise dragon is Sera Khandro, born in the water dragon year. The connection between women and code runs deep in Tibetan cultural memory, even to the very founding of the empire itself, with the story of Semakar's coded message to her older brother, Songtsen Gampo, that led to his conquest of Jiangshung, which sticks in my mind because Tenzin Deki wove that into her address at the Lotsawa workshop. For another famous example, one cannot but notice the particular skill of women to encode and decode in the life of Milarepa, when Nyangsa Khargyen, Mila's mother, sews gold into a yogin's cloak, and only the lama's wife is able to figure it out and retrieve the gold for Milarepa. And of course, in the treasure tradition, Yeshe Tsogyal is famous for encoding Padmasambhava's treasure texts in scripts called Khandro Daik, which male treasure revealers need female consorts to decode. In Sera Khandro's case, apparitional dakinis are constantly appearing before her with coded prophecy, offering her enigmatic encouragement. Here, Sera Khandro's doublespeak is not about sacred revelation, but marital discord, illustrating that secular concerns sound even where least expected in this traditional Tibetan namtar about spiritual liberation. Notable also in this passage is the way that Sera Khandro's visionary aptitude and skill at revelation render her a demoness in the eyes of Gyaltse and his kin, suggesting the mixed blessing of female power. In this moment, when she fails to fulfill her domestic duties the way Gyaltse wants, she moves from Dakini to demoness, or to transpose this into terms local to my own birthplace of Boston, from healer to witch. Okay, moving on. Episode 4, called My Husband is an Ass. It was about wit, right? You know? We were going to go there pretty soon. You knew. The same passage we were just reading continues with no break at all from where we just left off. During this time, one day Gyaltse went to visit his middle brother, Jigme Kunchok, who was a monk at Pelyo Monastery. I was alone, and there wasn't anybody around. A Tsogyal Shelcham, final testament of Tsogyal, from the oral transmission Dharma cycle of my treasures, together with her biography, had come to me as a revelation. I had written it down earlier, but the end was unfinished. When I was writing the lines, I have no purpose aside from benefiting sentient beings. It is impossible for a jewel to be stained by mud. Phenomena depend only on interdependent causation. All of a sudden, an old monk named Kyaga Kunzang arrived. Saying it was an offering, he came with a full plate of tsampa bread. He saw the text that I was writing and asked, "What's that text?" "It's a treasure scripture," I replied. "It's shocking that you are taking care of Gara Lama's treasure scripture," he said. "It's terrible that you ruined Gyaltse." Daki kesang Gyaltse ke ngadabu nakmoshik luna bongli gola sersap shakpe petang tsong. Daki kesang Gyaltse la ne kelme kilkor shamyak kiteng du bupa chuden serwashin nangdun ge yeshe la pemba mato ne che me. I retorted, "Your Gyaltse getting a wife like me is like the proverb of harnessing a donkey with a golden bridle. I haven't inflicted harm on your Gyaltse, like saying a nectar-filled vase on top of a finely assembled mandala. All I did was benefit his inner wisdom, not harm it. If you think that I harmed Gyaltse before he was with me, your Gyaltse was surely already ruined." He too became angry and said whatever harmful things he could to hurt me. Due to that, I burned the oral transmission instruction of Tsogyal in the fire and vowed not to write profound treasures. And what's interesting is this text doesn't exist in her Terche, suggesting that perhaps we are both in the realm of literature and life as we hear this. Honestly, I just really love this metaphor. At first, it was hard for me to actually envision a golden bridle, and Lama Jap and I have had conversations about this. So here you go. This one is housed at the Met in New York as part of their Arms and Armor collection. Of course, you'd only put a golden bridle on your best horse, a stallion for a military general or something like that. Not a donkey. So no, Sera Khandro did not actually say in so many words, "My husband is an ass," but she came really quite close through the Tibetan art of the well-placed proverb. The other really interesting word in this line is nakmo, this kesang gyaltse nga dabu nakmo shigluna, which I translated as wife. This word deserves to be the center of its own separate research, considering the conflation of darkness, impurity, criminality, and femininity wrapped up in it. What's interesting in the context of Sera Khandro's Namtar is that elsewhere she never uses nakmo to refer to herself. And so here she's intentionally insulting herself by identifying as Gyaltse's wife in this mundane sense. Elsewhere, she calls herself neither nun nor laywoman, jomen nakmen, or neither servant nor bride. We heard that expression in another quote, yogmen nemen. In any case, Sera Khandro's anger flashes through these lines, fresh even now, a century later. The last passage I want to share with you is not funny, especially given the ongoing trauma caused by sex abuse in several international Vajrayana Buddhist communities. With that in mind, I think it's really important to listen carefully to what historical women such as Sera Khandro had to say about the problem of religious men soliciting sex, which is apparently an old problem. Sera Khandro applied her sharp wit to this topic as well, proving that critique is not some sort of Western liberal prerogative. I'm writing about this in more depth in a separate article right now, but today I want to leave you with just a small piece of Sera Khandro's mind on this matter. The year is 1916, and Sera Khandro is 24, still living with Gyaltse, and now the mother of their 3-year-old daughter, Chuying Droma. Out of the blue, Sera Khandro writes that Dekapsu ninchik kara gyatsen sheba deongne kyo ngarang na gyatse ne nawa autobiography trepa dogo yang serdukbe daki sambala korange losam duki lapardanyamde. One day, Gara Gyaltsen came and said again and again, since Gyaltse, her husband, Sedro, gave me permission to have you, we need to get together. I thought to myself that it seemed like his mind had been possessed by demons. That's a really bad come-on line for Sera Khandro, as you can tell from what we've already heard about her feelings for Gyaltse, or maybe against Gyaltse. Notable here is the possessive tone of this phrase, I have permission from Gyaltse for you, or to have you. Also interesting is the expression chirpa drelgur, which literally means something more like we need to make a practice connection or have a physical relationship. Her response to this is quite long, including accusing this monk of wasting his precious human birth and being overwhelmed with lust. She recaps his reply cryptically. He said a lot about lewd behavior and violations of decency. This launched Sera Khandro into this 8-syllable verse. I don't desire someone with an evil body like you. I may be an ordinary person with an inferior female body, but my face is beautiful, that of a Khandro. My mentality may appear like that of a silly woman, but my mind sees the essence of the unborn 3 bodies. My work may look samsaric, but I have never parted from the primordial wisdom of equanimity. By mastering the 10 winds, everything appears as the nature of great bliss, and I am liberated in the expanse of coextensive space and primordial wisdom. I don't need someone with a body like yours. I won't create suffering in this life and the next. You, dissolute one, think carefully. Don't exchange your important body for a meaningless one. When the fruits of karma undeceivingly ripen, faint-hearted one, what will you do? Now think about this and control yourself. In conclusion, we can trace distinct ties between concerns Sera Khandro voiced about sexual misconduct and violence, the ethics of Vajrayana consort practices, domestic abuse, and misogyny, and topics featured in contemporary Tibetan women's writing. Some people say that traditional or pre-modern Tibetan writing is all about religion, all about praising the guru, whereas at long last, modern Tibetan writing opens up space for the love of literature as an end in itself. But if you really read Sera Khandro's autobiography, it is both an example of the traditional Tibetan genre of Nantar, the story of her complete spiritual liberation, and a work of great Tibetan literature. The candor and artistry with which Sera Khandro spun verse and dialogical prose about her quotidian and sublime life experiences blends social critique with Buddhist devotion in eloquent language that bespeaks a love of literary expression extending beyond Buddhist soteriology or record-keeping utility. As I think about the ways in which Sera Khandro fits into the kaleidoscope of 20th century Tibetan writing, another famous figure comes to mind, Gendun Tripel, and I didn't actually realize that Heather Stoddard would be in the audience. But luckily, there are no questions, so I think I'm still safe. Anyway, Sera Khandro never traveled outside of Tibetan cultural areas as Gendun Tripel famously did, nor does her writing reflect his particular flavor of iconoclasm, but they share more than similar birth and death dates. They share a love of wordplay that is perhaps most apparent in the acrostic poetry Khatsum each wrote. Actually, some of their word choices almost sound like they were sending telepathic text messages to each other. They're so similar. They also share the fact that their literary brilliance was lost to the Tibetan public for many decades after their deaths due to the duzing, or time of turmoil, as Ju Kazong phrased it. Given this chasm of lost decades, there's a tendency to attach strong period labels to 20th century Tibetan literature, moving from traditional pre-modern genres of writing and then starting up again in the 1980s with modern Tibetan literature after decades of rupture. In this schema, the end of pre-modern Tibet, and I have like scare quotes around that, is often problematically conflated with Tibet's incorporation into the People's Republic of China, as if Tibetan thinkers, writers, and government officials were not also part of the 20th century before this occurred, and were not also exploring new, distinctively Tibetan literary and political formations. Both Sera Khandro and Gendun Tripel lived in these dynamically changing times at the turn of the 20th century, and we see this reflected in their writing. Perhaps then, we can think of their works as bridges between older, traditional Tibetan genres, which are often presented as relentlessly religious, and newer forms of modern Tibetan poetry and prose, which are often presented as fundamentally secular, even as Buddhist imagery, ideas, and ethics thread through them. Or better yet, Sera Khandro's writings are treasures, buried during a time that was not yet ripe for them, ready for us to rediscover. Thank you.